I have the great fortune of talking with an old friend of mine and colleague of the Jesus Seminar, Robert J. Miller. Bob is the professor of religious studies at Juniata College in Pennsylvania, and he's been a fellow of the seminar. That's what they call us, by the way, fellows, not mere members, since 1986, which is pretty close on the heels of the founding of the group. And he was a scholar in residence at the West Star Institute in 2001. You might have seen his books, in case his name sounds familiar, that's probably why that, and a few newspaper stories. He's the author of Born Divine, a fascinating comparative study of nativity myths and such, and then The Apocalyptic Jesus, a debate. That brings up a question I'm going to quiz him on later. And then a really fascinating book called The Jesus Seminar and Its Critics. And Bob's edited a book called The Complete Gospels in 92 and revised in 94, which contains new translations of just about every scrap of a gospel that has been discovered, the four familiar ones and everything else you've never even heard of, and endlessly interesting. And so let me, after that long-windedness, welcome you onto the show, Bob.
Well, thank you very much, Bob. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
How long have you, well, you started in 86, back in the seminar. How did you come to be involved with it?
Well, it had begun just in 85, so I just heard about it from a friend, and he said, this thing sounds really unusual and interesting. Why don't we go check it out? So I didn't really have any strong scholarly commitment to studying the historical Jesus, but I thought it would be, something worthwhile to investigate. And I came to my first meeting, and I was just amazed that so many scholars could tackle such a serious problem and do so in a way that was collaborative. I mean, of course, there was a lot of vigorous debate, but it was not the sort of staid, kind of more, shall we say, standoffish thing that I was used to from professional meetings. This was a real meeting of the minds, even if there was a lot of, like I said, a lot of disagreement. And it was a way in which people had committed to a project in which the group work seemed to be more important than individual egos. And in scholarship, that's quite rare. So I was hooked a lot by the ethos of the work as much as by the topic of it.
Yeah, I echo that. I have to say, having been to Society of Biblical Literature meetings where, needless to say, a lot of great work is done, and having been to the Jesus Seminar many more times, the difference is immediate and palpable. You don't get the impression that so many of the people, as at other professional society conferences, are there to pad their resumes and to try to get a raise. None of which is blameworthy, but somehow the motivation is, and the feeling is completely different, as you say, with the camaraderie, and it's a unique thing I hope can be emulated, though it's harder to imagine that being done on a bigger scale, but who knows?
Yeah, one of the things that many people may not know is that at your typical academic meeting, what happens is that someone will come and maybe have half an hour, and that person then will essentially read a paper for like 25 minutes and then take a few questions, and then it's on to the next topic. Whereas at the seminar, all the papers are distributed many weeks ahead of time, and people come having read everything, and so no one actually reads a paper. We spend the whole time in give and take and conversation and sometimes, real knockdown debate. And at the end of that, what's quite unique about the seminar is that there's a process of voting in which the fellows then have to answer on their ballots, how they stand or fall on various propositions which were offered in each paper. So it gives people who present papers immediate feedback, which is sometimes very gratifying and sometimes quite chastening. And so it is a place where your ego really tends to rub down a bit because you have to take seriously the fact that your peers are rendering their verdict on your work.
Yeah, I only nearly got into a fist fight once there. It's been very very positive, and now I've patched up things with that guy. What would you say is this seems obvious, but I don't think it is. What would you say is the goal of the Jesus Seminar?
Well, the seminar really has two, shall we say, basic formal goals, and one is to pursue topics of vital concern to scholars in Christian origins, and to do that in collaborative ways, in ways that harness people's energies and work together in terms of group work on a long-term project. So instead of people pursuing projects as lone scholars, off in their study, that the work is all through the process being worked out in dialogue with others. So it's that unique collaborative venue which is very important. And secondly, and this makes the seminar, I think, unique among any other academic organizations, it has an explicit mission to public education, in that our work is always done with a view towards informing the public about it, without pulling any punches as to our presuppositions or our results, and trying to make the work of biblical scholars accessible to people, not by talking down to them, but by trying to speak in language that everyone can understand.
I noticed that there was an awful lot, for years in Time, Newsweek, anybody else that took notice, they would say, look at this bunch of nuts. They're publicity hounds, and they have crazy ideas that no one else agrees with. When I knew from the first discussion I heard there that all of this was, though innovative, was well within the mainstream. It was not eccentric in any way, but it sounded that way to people who had never heard of what was, what had been going on for a couple of centuries in biblical scholarship. And to say that the seminar was just a bunch of publicity grabbers was just a pejorative way of saying what you just did accurately, that they wanted people to get a whiff of this finally. And you could tell a lot of folks were very upset. They didn't want this coming out. You mean, this is what biblical scholars really think, and it is. They just don't like to say so.
Yeah, it's amazing from our perspective as scholars is that what sometimes the public found most shocking were things that scholars have routinely just assumed for about 200 years. And the shock value didn't come from the work itself. It came from the fact that this stuff has been kept under wraps, that scholars have had really no interest in talking to the public, and in most cases have just not been willing to, because they were afraid to come up against the kind of fundamentalism which seems to be taken for granted in our culture. I mean, until the Jesus Seminar came on the scene, whenever the media wanted to get an expert's advice on the Bible, they turned to someone like Jerry Falwell or somebody like that, and the seminar changed that. Seminar was really the first time that this public airing of scholarship went out through the mass media. And so we had a series of articles in Time and Newsweek, even on some TV documentaries about that. And what it did was expose Americans who wanted to learn about it to what critical biblical scholars had been doing for quite some time. And you're right, Bob, it put a lot of our peers on the hot seat, because then they had to answer the question, well, why haven't you been telling us about these things?
I've had students in rural North Carolina community colleges, adult students, hear just some basic stuff about the Old or New Testament, and they'd say, why did I never hear of this? I thought I would never understand this till I got to heaven, and they had the big seminar up there on unanswered questions. I said, no, we got a lot of those answers, but you might not want to hear them, or somebody might not want you to hear them. But you always have both reactions. This is heresy, or thank God, I can understand this now. And it's just amazing the reactions you get from Bible fans on both sides.
It is quite, I want to affirm that. That's my experience, too, both as a college teacher and as someone who speaks a lot in public, is that many people are quite threatened by it. But many people who have a kind of affection for the Bible and the Christian tradition, but can't take it literally, haven't until they come across this kind of exposure to our work. They don't know how to take the Bible at all, so they just ignore it. And what this work in the seminar does, and it's not just the seminar, but scholars like us, is open up a way by which people can fully engage as critical thinkers and still take the Bible seriously, though not literally, and understand it as one of the pillars of our Western culture.
I found in my work with the free thought community that there is nothing that will garner immediate galvanized interest as much as questions about the Bible. All these atheists and agnostics, oh man, more Bible. They want to hear about this. They've always kind of heard it's all true or it's all bunk, but to actually get into the unraveling the thing, they seem to be fascinated by it.
Well, that's fascinating, yeah.
Do you think the direction of the Jesus Seminars changed since Bob Funk's untimely passing? In case people don't know, Robert W. Funk was one of the founders and really the leading light of the seminar from the beginning, and he passed away a few years ago, and it's been carrying on pretty vigorously. But has there been any change of direction since then?
No, the change of direction, as much as we lament Bob's passing, the work of the seminar has continued more or less in continuity with what was before. The major change in the work of the seminar came after we actually finished the work on the historical Jesus. I mean, we began that project in '85, and it took us 12 years, actually, of meeting twice a year and all the time in between. It took us 12 years to work through all the Gospels, verse by verse, and do our analyses and our voting, and then give judgments as to the historical value of each and every verse in those Gospels. After that, then, it's fascinating because we really didn't quite know what to do. I mean, once you have, so to speak, done Jesus, where do you go from there, right? I mean, we've had projects going on the historical Paul, which actually, I think in terms of upsetting the Orthodox apple cart, would probably be more explosive, actually, than our findings on Jesus. We've had a seminar on the Acts of the Apostles, which is, the New Testament book purporting to tell the history of the early church, but historically turns out to be 99% fictitious. And we've had a seminar on Christian origins, trying to understand how we got historically from Jesus to Christianity. But that work has been more diffuse and less, of course, less able to gather sort of media attention or the public's interest because it's not so, shall we say, laser focused on something as attention-getting as Jesus himself.
I remember being in one of these latter-day sessions where the topics all had to do with the economics of ancient Galilee. I have to admit I had trouble staying awake for that one. You're not going to get any protesters outside on that.
Yeah, but yet you can see why scholars would take that seriously because the message of Jesus about the kingdom of God is largely having to do with, how human beings should live on this earth in a way that allocates resources so that poor people, so that every human being gets treated with the dignity of a child of God. And of course, Jesus' message, for it to be real, has to be understood against the real life facts of his time and place. And so the economics of Galilee is actually very important to getting a handle on the sort of real time effects of the message of Jesus. But as you say, that's a very hard thing to explain in a soundbite, to a reporter.
You've written these various books. So which is your own favorite of your books, and what is the present focus of your own scholarly research?
Well, the book that I wrote called Born Divine was just a real adventure for me to write, and because, as you pointed out earlier, the heart of it is a comparative study between the stories about the birth of Jesus in the stories of other people in the ancient world who were known to be, or who were believed to be, sons of God because they had a God for a father and a human for a mother. And I just thought, what can we learn about the early Christian mentality by putting those stories in that context? And it was just so interesting for me to get into the nitty-gritty of that. As well as in that book, what I did also was follow out the string of what we call infancy gospels, as far as I could trace it. And infancy gospels were stories, all very fanciful, written by Christians to sort of fill out in imaginative detail all the things that the Bible is silent about. All the details of the early life of Jesus, of his boyhood adventures, of his superpowers, as a kid. And it was fascinating, Bob, that Christians continued to write these Gospels up into like the 10th and 11th centuries.
Wow.
So even as late as that, Christians were very consciously writing fictions about the life of Jesus, and these were being understood, of course, as fictions, and being read and nonetheless cherished for the sort of parable, I guess, truth they had about Jesus. And what that told me is that, people's minds in the ancient world were just as supple as ours, that they could tell the difference between history and fiction and treat each accordingly. And it's just the kind of stupid wooden heads today we have, in which everything has to be either a fact, or a falsehood, that we don't easily understand how fiction can be a vehicle for a different kind of truth. And that's partly because, we're having to fight the whole fundamentalist issue that sort of creates this polarization. But it was really just a delight for me to be able to pursue that research for that book. Right now, I happen to be writing a book on the early Christian belief that Jesus fulfills the Old Testament prophecies. What I'm doing is tracking down many of the claims the New Testament makes that Jesus fulfills this or that prophecy. And most of the time, when you actually compare the prophecy that they're quoting to this original text in the Old Testament, you'll find that it's been changed. Oftentimes, the New Testament writers, because Jesus doesn't quite fulfill these prophecies, they just change the Old Testament text so that he does fulfill them. And I just find that really interesting, and hardly anybody knows about this, and it's so simple. All you have to do is compare the actual text from the Old Testament to the text quoted in the New Testament, and you see, well, that's interesting. The New Testament writers are just rewriting the Bible to suit their purposes. And that's fascinating to me, especially because this belief that Jesus fulfills the Old Testament prophecies throughout Christian history has been used as kind of a stick to beat the Jews with. The Jews should have known that Jesus was the Messiah because look how he fulfills all these prophecies. Whereas, in fact, any Jew who knew his Bible would not be remotely persuaded by these so-called proofs because the Christians were monkeying around with the wording of the biblical text. So that's what's got me interested now, and it's quite an adventure to get a hold on that.
I got to read that. That is fascinating. It's sort of like a step in the direction of what Randall Helms said in Gospel Fictions, that so much of the New Testament or the narratives are rewrites of the Old Testament. And what you're suggesting is like, here is a step in that direction where it's not exactly proof value from prior documents. It's like, let's recast those prophecies to fit our story, which is a whole different thing.
Or let's rewrite the story to fit the prophecy.
Yeah.
Let me just give you one just incredible example of that, and that's the story where Jesus comes riding into Jerusalem on a donkey. Everyone probably knows about that scene, right? And people are putting palm trees down there, palm leaves and all this business. And when Mark tells that story, it says that this is to fulfill the prophecy. I don't know the exact words, but that your king comes riding on a colt, on the foal of a donkey. Now, when Matthew picks up Mark's gospel, Matthew's using Mark as his source, and he reads that verse on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Matthew reads that as if the prophecies talking about two different animals. And so, sure enough, when Matthew writes the story, believe it or not, Matthew says that Jesus got these two animals and he sat on them, in the plural, and he rode them both into town. So we have Jesus doing this rodeo stunt in Matthew's gospel, in order that Matthew can show, look how literally Jesus fulfills this prophecy. And it's the most ludicrous scene you can imagine. And you can see it's the clearest proof, right, that New Testament writers felt free to alter the story if it would help them score a theological point, even if it's based upon a rather, I think, ridiculous understanding of the Old Testament text.
Yeah, that's got to take the cake, but Matthew loves to mine Zechariah. How does he know how much Judas got for turning in Jesus? Oh, 30 pieces of silver. Oh, where'd you get that? Gospel of Mark, Q, Christian tradition?
That's an example of the same thing, except if you read it carefully, you'll see that the verse he quotes from Zechariah, Matthew says, comes from the prophet Jeremiah. Yes. which is really given a headache to people who believe the Bible contains no errors, because here we have one biblical writer making a Bible knowledge mistake, which is very, very embarrassing.
Oh, boy. What a tangled web we weave when first we practice to believe. I tell you. That is so fascinating. You know, you have such a gift for in print and in the spoken word for clarifying issues. I want to try this one on you, though many would not dare to do this on a radio interview. But answer this and for us. Albert Schweitzer, Rudolf Bultmann, and loads of other scholars thought Jesus was a proclaimer of the imminent end of the world, but now most of the fellows of the Jesus Seminar and lots of other scholars just don't buy this anymore. Why did the apocalyptic Jesus, I know you've written a book about this, so I figure it's a good question. Why did the apocalyptic Jesus model decline, and what sort of Jesus was he replaced with?
Well, this is the thing that among scholars the seminar is probably the most well known for, is that the Jesus Seminar was the first, shall we say, scholarly movement to question seriously, and in fact, in our minds at least, to reject the dominant consensus that Jesus was a preacher of imminent end times. And there's several lines of evidence that lead to this conclusion, and each of them by itself is not that amazing, but when they all come together, it makes a very strong case. One of them is that our earliest gospel, which is Mark's gospel, portrays Jesus as an end times prophet. But it turns out that a careful analysis of that gospel shows that that portrait of Jesus is largely the result of the author's own touches on the story, so that we believe that Mark himself is the one who decided to portray Jesus that way. And that if we take away the identifiable Markan coloring of the story, that we don't see an apocalyptic figure beneath that. Another very important piece of evidence is that the parables of Jesus, when you look at them in their own context and don't read into them meanings that come from someplace else, they're not about the end of the world. They're about how God's kingdom comes to earth right now and begins to spread out among people here and now. And that these end times interpretations of the parables have been added at a later time. And biblical scholars have pretty sophisticated literary tools for identifying what's original in a parable and what's an added interpretation. And usually the apocalyptic readings of those parables are in those added interpretations. And then one final thing is this is going to be rather technical, but it's important, is there's another text called the Q Gospel, which we don't actually have any physical copies of, but has been pretty carefully reconstructed by comparing passages in Matthew's Gospel with Luke's Gospel. And the experts in the Q Gospel are fairly well agreed that that Gospel was not written all at once, that it was written in two stages, and they can tell that by use of these literary analytical tools, and that the first stage of this gospel is a gospel that has no end times teaching in it at all, and that the end times material comes in the second edition of this gospel. And what that tells us is that the very first Christians did not think about Jesus as an end times prophet, and that portrait of him comes to play later at a time around the Jewish-Roman War, which, if you're living in Palestine, is the end of the world. It was a horrible, violent, absolutely unbelievably horrific war to be part of. I mean, the Romans slaughtered about 1 million Jews. It was just completely off the charts of anything we would think of in terms of atrocities. So people living through that and thinking about Jesus, began to see him in their own context, and we think that's where so much of the apocalyptic thinking about Jesus comes to play. That's when Mark's gospel, for example, is written. So there's more I could say, but that's the kind of thing that the seminar began to take seriously, and not thinking in general terms, but going through verse by verse all the gospels, and asking these hard questions about it, just over and over and over again. The non-apocalyptic portrait of Jesus began to seem more and more credible. So that instead of an end times prophet preaching imminent end of the world and coming judgment, we found that the historical Jesus was more likely to be a wisdom teacher, someone we call a sage, who was telling parables and giving teachings to help people understand a whole new way to look at the world around them and to perceive how God was working within it. And that was not connected to threats of going to hell in the end times if you didn't accept it.
That is very well put, and a very compelling evidence, like this Q thing, for instance. What are the chances that if this were the big thrust of Jesus, you just wouldn't find it in the bedrock straight? That defies probability. And
yes, it's very hard to understand that if Jesus really was this fiery preacher of judgment, why the Q gospel in its first edition just doesn't have that in it. That's just almost impossible to explain how that could have happened. And so the alternative hypothesis just makes much, much more sense, that the apocalyptic coloring in the Gospels comes in at a time when, or at a later time, when Christians are running into problems that make that portrait of Jesus much more appealing and much more relevant to their very difficult life.
The Mark and Apocalypse in chapter 13 almost says as much when it warns people not to confuse the prophetic revolutionary leaders of the temple siege period with Jesus. You don't have a warning against what people are not doing. And for somebody to have been doing that is almost to say they were reimagining Jesus as if he were Simon Bar-Gioras or one of these other warrior messiahs. So this isn't just some sort of idle speculation. Even this is directly anticipated in the text. It's amazing. And what an accomplishment the seminar in general, and you in particular, have made to point this out. It's like having a veil removed in many, many ways.
Yeah, and it also just helps it just makes it much more intelligible what Jesus was about. Because if you take all the teachings of the Gospels sort of at face value and try to put them together into a coherent portrait, what you get really is two very different kind of oil and water things which don't really mix too well. You have on the one hand this guy who teaches in these fascinating parables and aphorisms, or shall we say wisdom sayings, and then says, let those who have ears to hear, let them hear, which means figure it out for yourself. And who teaches people to love their enemies and to, do all these unexpected things like love people who are of different ethnic background than your own. So you've got that portrait. And on the other hand, you've got this other guy saying, oh yeah, and by the way, the world's ending soon and God's going to smoke you if you don't get on my train. Those two things just seem so completely incompatible. They seem like it's two different characters who are being mixed together. And historically, the seminar's work has helped us to see that both of those portraits are intelligible. One comes from the historical Jesus, and the other comes from the Christians about 30 or 40 years after his death, who are trying to redo his life and teachings in a context that makes sense to them in their times of enormous stress.
Of course, this is the kind of thing that a lot of our detractors and apologists don't buy. I kind of running out of time, but I cannot let this one go past. I just find I debate fundamentalist scholars and apologists fairly regularly, and it's often frustrating. I'd like to hear your stance about whether these debates have any value. I believe I know what it is, and it's very interesting.
I think that the net effect of these is to lend legitimacy to fundamentalist scholars, because it looks as if we are taking them seriously as colleagues and peers, whereas in fact their assumptions are so fundamentally different from what I would think of as true and honest critical scholarship. I mean, all of their decisions and all of their positions are predictated by their conservative theology. And I'm really worried that the net effect of these, us people like you and me debating with them is to lend them a credibility that they really don't deserve. So I have a lot of reservations about these debates. What do you think, Bob?
Well, I believe you're correct, but on the other hand, it enhances their credibility in the eyes of their own constituency anyway. They're believing the same thing they would about the legitimacy of their scholars and their viewpoint, no matter what I might say. And I feel like there probably is a thin edge of questioning or unconvinced people that may hope the apologetics are true and fear they are not. And if I have the chance to get in there and say, well, your fears are well-founded, these people sadly do not know whereof they speak, I think I might be doing a favor to those people, and the other ones, if it's just entertainment to them, so be it. I think you are right. It's just I'm kind of aiming at a very thin slice of the audience, and the questions I usually get when the exchange is over tends to kind of confirm my hope that a surprising number of them have genuine questions and aren't just trying to put me in my place, and which I thought they would all be doing. But surprisingly, a lot of them really do seem to want to hear another side. So I keep it up when I'm asked to do it. I'd never initiate them. And you are right, though. The one bad byproduct, like Dawkins says about evolution, there is the risk of making people think that we're taking it more seriously than we are.
Well, I mean, I was talking about the effect this creates among scholars. You're talking about the effects on the real-life audience. So I think what you had to say really doesn't contradict what I say, and I'll have to think more about what you say, because many of us who are in this position came out of pretty traditional backgrounds and can point to some experience of reading or hearing someone talk, that really helped us to question things in a way that set us free from those kinds of intellectual shackles.
There used to be this, it may still be this radio show done kind of like an old soap opera with organ music, etc., from the Pacific Garden Mission called Unshackled, and each one of them was how I got saved from drunkenness or whatever. It'd be great to do an intellectually unshackled, where people say
how I got saved from fundamentalism.
Yeah, that would be fascinating. Oh, boy. Well, not so fascinating, though, as this interview. You're really a great guest, and I'd love to have you back on The Point of Inquiry. Thank you so much for spending the time with us, Bob.
Well, it's been a real pleasure, Bob. Thanks.